Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry for the late start, but it's okay. Who's excited about tonight? Yay! Yay! Just some housekeeping. Please put your phones on silent. And if you could keep your mouths on silent generally when the speakers are on, that would be really respectful. There's plenty of time for talking after. If you haven't found the toilets, they're around the corner of this building. We're gonna have about an hour of really fun, interesting information sharing tonight. We have 3 speakers, and they'll each talk for about 10 minutes. And we also have Toby from City Farm, and he's gonna share a bit about City Farm. But before we do that, I wanted to let you know that Perth Green Drinks is not associated with the Greens Party. However, the Greens in Northbridge actually did lend us their speaker tonight, so I thank them for that. Just don't even clap. I'm gonna thank everyone and then you can clap. Unless you spontaneously want to clap in the middle for no apparent reason, and then you can just do that. More than anything, I'd like to thank Flavia, but I'm gonna do that last. The Hidden Pantry is here tonight providing the lovely food that you're having. We also have Harris Organic Wines, so we wanted to thank them. And Little Creatures for the free beer. Hopefully you got one of those. You came here early, right? They gave us 8 cases, so. Central Institute of Technology is our regular venue sponsor, and they do a lot for us. And also tonight our venue is obviously City Farm. I'm going to invite Toby Whittington from City Farm to come up and share for a few moments about what City Farm is all about in case you're not sure and you're very curious. So please join me in welcoming Toby.
Thanks a lot. So, well, Perth City Farm welcomes you and welcomes Perth Green Drinks here for the last one of the year. And firstly, I'd like to say what a fantastic thing Perth Green Drinks actually is, and the fact that it's all done on volunteer time and effort. And while we've been holding back our applause, now's the time to let them know how great this is. So Perth City Farm was established here by men of the trees in 1994, and the site here was an abandoned industrial wasteland, and previous to that it had been used as a scrap metal yard and battery recycling plant. At the time it was EPRA who were involved with men of the trees to remediate the land, and 2 metres of topsoil from the gardens was removed and 2 metres was put back in so that we could actually grow vegetables on this site. And over the last 20 years, there's been hundreds of thousands of volunteers, hours, blood, sweat and tears involved in keeping the farm here and securing a head lease for the farm so it could go on into the future. And our organisation is actually Green World Revolution. We've been contracted recently by Men of the Trees to manage the farm. We're now looking into the future of the farm, and we're wanting to turn this entire complex into a space where local residents of Perth, like yourselves, can come 5 to 7 days a week and buy fresh organic food. So it seemed fitting that I should have a little talk about that before you start up on tonight's speakers. We want to set up a market type space here where the gardens out the back that you've seen, we're now starting to transform them into a production farm and a production garden where you'll be able to buy all your organic food and come down to the farm and engage with the community here. And we're underpinning that with social enterprise. And I think what a lot of people don't realise, but a lot of the work here that's done at the farm is done by people who are work experience or previously worked for the dole. They're unemployed people, and we're giving these people a space here to engage back in with the workforce, to engage with environmental issues, and to do something for the community. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to welcome everyone, enjoy your time, and thank you very much.
So I said that I was going to thank Flavia last. Where is Flavia? Flavia, where are you? Tell her to come in here. Because Flavia is really the single-handed person that makes all these events happen. Yes, gorgeous. And in honor of Flavia's amazingness, I would just like to dedicate this next song. Feel free to join in if you know the words, because you really don't want to just hear my voice on this. Okay. Are you ready? Don't be nervous. You're going to be great.
Come on. Good.
Flavia, this one's for you. Did you ever know that you're my hero? Come on, join in. You're everything I would like to be. Come on, join in, people. I could fly higher than an eagle, but you are the wind beneath my wings. Where was my standing ovation? I don't know. Anyways, so tonight's theme is food. Food sustainability. Who likes food? Food is one of the strongest links that we as city people have to sustainability. Some people ask questions like, where does our food come from? How is it produced? How good is it for our health and the health of the planet? So tonight, to help us answer those questions and explore some other ideas about food sustainability, we have our panel. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and when they've got to 8 minutes, I'm going to make this noise. No, not that one. That one. So that they know they've got 2 minutes to wrap up. And tonight our panel is Andrew Moore, who's a passionate sustainability professional. Also Charles Otway, who's dedicated to the study and practice of permaculture. And Shona Hunter. She's the owner of the Hidden Pantry Thoughtful Catering, whose food you've been enjoying tonight. I'm going to introduce Andrew first. Andrew is a passionate sustainability professional that has conducted life cycle assessment studies in a wide range of industry sectors, including dairy, clean energy, mining, metals, and building construction. He's a lecturer at Murdoch University and an active member of the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society. Andrew is also a cancer, and he's a passionate mountain bike rider. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
I don't know how I'm going to top any of that. Don't know where to get started. Oh, okay. Yeah, so tonight I want to talk about a life cycle assessment perspective on some foods. So most of you, let's see some hands on who has heard of life cycle assessment before or not. Oh, actually, well, I think my work's done. I don't really need to talk. No, I'll give you a rundown for those of you who don't know what life cycle assessment is. In life cycle assessment, you assess sustainability not just in one part of the life cycle, but you look at the whole life cycle. So we're talking about the production, we're talking about the mining, the manufacturing, the use phase of whatever the product is, and then the end of life disposal. And my job is basically, I'm an environmental investigator, to have a look at this whole life cycle of whatever it is I've been asked to look at, and to work out ways to minimise the environmental impacts from a whole of life perspective. So if we look at a car, for example, some of you probably can't see the car, but there is a car icon there. Some of the colours aren't coming out too poppy. If you have a look at the environmental impacts for the production and use and end of life of a car, and if we're talking about the carbon footprint in this instance, and you really can't see those colours. That's no good. But anyway, I'll improvise. There should be a little graph here that goes up to about 10% of the environmental impact. And then we have the use phase has the most of the environmental impact, and the end of life has a small part of the environmental impact, if we're talking about carbon footprint. So when I'm doing my environmental investigations, I would call this the hotspot, is the use phase. So there it makes a lot of sense to target the car and the fuel use of the car to make sure that you decrease the environmental impact overall. But what you want to do is you want to decrease the impact here without increasing the impact associated with the production of the vehicle at the same time, so you don't just burden shift from one part of the life cycle to the other. So if we look at a different product, such as photovoltaic panels, and again you're not going to see the grey because it's not coming out. The hotspot for solar panels is actually the production of the panels. Solar panels don't really do anything when they're in the use phase, they just sit on your roof and make power. And this was the first life cycle assessment study I did, was looking at the myth around photovoltaic panels installed in Perth, Western Australia. So the myth was it takes more energy to produce a solar system than it will ever generate. Well, it turns out when you look at the whole life cycle, this is an absolute myth. It takes less than 1.5 years for the energy of production to be paid back, and then you have over 30 years where the system is going to be generating more energy than it took to make it in the first place. So yeah, I basically look at these myths and do all of the science and look at all the numbers to work out whether they're true or not, and how we can reduce the environmental impacts from a whole of life perspective. And it's been an interesting journey, because a lot of the companies that employ someone like myself, they're companies that you love and they're companies that you hate and they're products you use, but often you have no idea that they're actually having this work done. Companies all around the world that are investing millions of dollars in doing a lot of research into sustainability, and zip gets out because they don't want that information to be used back against them. But the companies I work with are working very hard to reduce their environmental impacts over the whole life cycle. Well, we're not here to talk about solar panels or cars, we're here to talk about food and the life cycle of food. So where does our food come from? A lot of kids, unfortunately, now you ask them, where does the food come from? Well, it comes from a carton or it comes from the shop. But when you look at it from a life cycle perspective, you have the production of the farm supplies. So this is the fertilisers, the feeds. Then we have the impacts that are associated with the on-farm. So this is the operation of agricultural equipment and the use of fertilisers and pesticides. We have the processing of the foods, the distribution of the foods, cooking. I hope people can see that little icon. Yeah, some can. And then the end-of-life disposal of the food. So if you have a look at this, this is the whole life cycle of our food production and use and disposal all mapped out. But a lot of life cycle assessment studies don't look at the whole life cycle in one go. They look at, if they look from including the farm supplies in the farm, we call that the cradle to gate or the farm gate. So I'll present some results from cradle to farm gate studies. There's also what they call grower to grocer. So this looks at the point right up to the distribution. So before you buy your food, so you can have a look at the environmental impacts from that perspective. Also, we've got the paddock to plate or farm to fork perspective. And then finally, you have your cradle to grave. So that includes the whole life cycle of the food. So when you're looking at studies or carbon footprints of different products, you need to ask yourself, what's the perspective here? What scope are they actually looking at? Now, life cycle assessment has been around for a long time. It's been around since 1960s. And it may be a bit of a shock horror for most of you that to realise that Coca-Cola was the first company in the world to do life cycle assessment, because they wanted to know what the environmental impact of their packaging was. Should we use plastic bottles, glass bottles or cans? And they wanted to quantify the environmental impacts over the whole life cycle. And when it comes to food, we've been doing a lot of work, but since 2003, it's been exponential growth up to now. There's over 80 studies been done on foods in Australia. There's still a lot of research to be done. When you're doing a life cycle assessment study, the first thing you do is you you have to get all the numbers, and we call this the inventory data. So it gives you some pretty interesting statistics. Like to produce 1 punnet of strawberries, this is a 200 punnet of strawberries, it takes 3 drops of pesticide. It takes 1 teaspoon, you can't see the teaspoon, a teaspoon of fertiliser. It takes 170 mils of diesel, and it takes 14 litres of water per punnet of strawberries. So what I do is I take all that environment, all those numbers, all that information, and then put it in a life cycle perspective. So here, if we look at the same strawberries, including the phases, the farm supplies, the farm, the processing and storage, and the distribution, most people would say, oh, it's the distribution that's the biggest impact. And then we'll give you the total carbon footprint figure at the end as well. But when you have a look at it, it's actually the emissions on the farm that contribute the most to the carbon footprint of the strawberry production. The distribution here has been modelled. This study was done by Curtin University, and I'll put all my slides up on the website, and all the references are impossible to see, but they're down the bottom here that you can click on, and that'll take you to the studies. So here they looked at distribution not only just around Perth, because this is production of strawberries in the Wanneroo area. This is distribution from the local area all the way up to Broome. So it's an average distribution. If we look at something like lettuce, we get a similar story where the emissions on the farm are the largest emissions, and the distribution is relatively small. If we come to something like mushrooms, you get a slightly different picture in that the farm supplies, this is the transport of all the huge amount of compost that you need in order to grow your mushrooms. So the biggest impact there is in the farm supply area. Oh dear. Okay, I know Rich gave a presentation from eTool and he went way over, so I'll see if I can speed it up a bit. So we can play a bit of a game here. Who thinks that the strawberries, and this is all for the same weight of product, we've got strawberries, lettuces and mushrooms, which one do you think will be the biggest? Who of those think it's the strawberries? No one. Mushrooms? Biggest carbon footprint for 250 grams of produce. Or the lettuce. Well, you guys must have seen the presentation, because it actually turns out the lettuce has the highest carbon footprint, 1.2 kilos per 250 grams of lettuce. If we start looking at it from a seasonal perspective, and here we can look at a study that was done by the CSIRO on tomatoes. They compared seasonally grown field tomatoes in Queensland, imported to Sydney market, with tomatoes grown in greenhouses in Sydney. And it turned out that for the ones that were grown in greenhouses, the biggest impact was at the farm level. But for the ones grown in Queensland in the field, obviously the biggest impact was for the distribution. But when you look at the overall results, here it shows that it doesn't necessarily, the produce which is grown locally is not necessarily the produce that has the lowest carbon footprint when you have a look at more of the life cycle. How about milk? We can flick through this one pretty quickly. This study was done for Dairy Australia, looking at the carbon emissions of their milk production to the farm gate level. And it turns out that the largest amount of emissions are actually from the cow itself. 57% of the emissions are enteric emissions, they call them, coming from the cow. Manure management was also huge, around 18%. And most people think it's the emissions coming out the back end of the cow that cause all the methane, but it's actually the burping of the methane that comes out the front, which is the problem. Okay, this one was to satisfy my eco-guilt of occasionally wanting to buy imported Italian pasta. So if we have a look at Italian pasta produced in Italy, and here it includes the cooking phase, so we've gone one more step. If you produce it and cook it in Italy using a gas flame, then your impacts on the farm and cooking at home have about the same impact. But here's where it gets a little bit funny. If you don't cook it with gas, you cook it with electricity, the story changes again. So now you have the biggest impact is the cooking. Now here I've taken the study and extended it to import the pasta all the way from Italy, 14,000 kilometres to Perth, so that I can eat it and cook it in Perth. Now you think, oh, the distribution's going to go through the roof. Actually, it doesn't. the cooking actually increases because our electricity here in Western Australia is dirtier than that in Italy. So that has more of an increase than the actual distribution. So when you're looking from a life cycle perspective, things often change around and aren't what you previously assumed. Tesco's in the UK, I'll wrap it up really quick. They did a food waste study recently released. They showed that up to 68% of the food that is produced in the whole supply chain ends up as waste. This is the highest for the bagged salads. And when it comes to disposal, there was a French study that actually looked at what should we do with our food waste. Should we put it in home compost bins or should we send it to industrial composting? Easy one. No, it's not. 65% of people don't operate their home compost properly. They run it anaerobically and it releases methane. So you're actually better off sending it to an industrial facility for electricity production. So all the myths just seem to be thrown around when you start looking at things from a life cycle perspective. But I didn't want to disempower everyone, so I've come up with these basic rules from all the research I've done on food. So if you use a life cycle perspective, you can really make significant impacts in improving your sustainability. Transport can be okay. Food miles, forget about it. Eat seasonal produce, definitely makes an impact. Minimise your food waste, and we need to do more research. So go to my website to have a look at more. Otherwise, also have a look at the Australian Life Cycle Society website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.